Rachel Adams rushed through the bustling hospital corridors, her focus laser-sharp on the tasks at hand. She expertly inserted IVs, checked vital signs, and administered medications with clockwork precision. Her efficiency was unmatched, but something crucial was missing. In room 412, Margaret lay in her bed, her frail body a stark contrast to the sterile white sheets. The elderly woman's eyes followed Rachel's movements, silently pleading for a moment of connection. Rachel barely glanced at her as she adjusted the morphine drip. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Johnson," she said briskly, already reaching for her chart to make notes. Later that morning, Rachel stood before the hospital board, her posture confident as she delivered a presentation on improving patient turnover rates. Graphs and statistics flashed on the screen behind her as she spoke eloquently about efficiency and cost-effectiveness. The directors nodded approvingly, impressed by her command of the data and her ambitious proposals. That evening, the hospital's annual gala was in full swing. Rachel, dressed in a sleek black dress, worked the room with practiced ease. She laughed at the right moments, asked insightful questions, and made sure to be seen by all the right people. As she clinked champagne glasses with the chief of surgery, she felt a surge of satisfaction. This was where she belonged, among the movers and shakers of the medical world. Meanwhile, back in room 412, Margaret stared at the ceiling, her breathing labored. The call button lay just out of reach, and no one had checked on her for hours. As the sounds of distant laughter drifted through her open door, a single tear rolled down her cheek. The next morning, Rachel strode into the hospital, her mind already racing with plans for the day. As she approached the nurse's station, she noticed an unusual hush. Her colleagues averted their eyes, and a palpable tension filled the air. Rachel, her supervisor, Dr. Patel, approached with a grave expression. "There's been an incident. Margaret Johnson passed away last night." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. She blinked, trying to process the information. "But she was stable yesterday," she stammered. Dr. Patel's face hardened. "She deteriorated rapidly. There's more. An anonymous complaint has been filed, alleging negligence in Mrs. Johnson's care. The hospital is launching an investigation." Rachel felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She looked around, suddenly aware of the accusing glances from her coworkers. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "I followed all protocols. You can check my charts." But as she spoke, doubt began to creep in. She remembered Margaret's pleading eyes, the call button she hadn't bothered to move closer. The realization of her failure hit her like a wave. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, Rachel gathered the nursing staff. "Listen," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know you all might be questioning my actions, but I assure you, everything I did was by the book. We can't let emotions cloud our judgment in these high-pressure situations." As she spoke, she saw the skepticism in their eyes. Her carefully crafted image was crumbling before her. The respect she had worked so hard to earn was slipping away, replaced by disappointment and mistrust. Rachel's mind raced, searching for a way to fix this, to explain away her actions. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had failed not just Margaret, but everything she claimed to stand for as a healthcare professional. Rachel sat alone in her darkened apartment, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. The sleek, modern furniture that once symbolized her success now felt cold and empty. She stared at her reflection in the window, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. Images of Margaret flashed through her mind, the loneliness in her eyes, the trembling hand reaching for comfort. Rachel had been so focused on climbing the career ladder that she'd forgotten the fundamental reason she became a nurse: to care for people. Overwhelmed by guilt, Rachel searched online for support groups. She found one for healthcare professionals dealing with burnout and ethical dilemmas. With trembling hands, she signed up for the next meeting. The following week, Rachel entered a community center, feeling out of place without her crisp uniform and professional demeanor. She sat in a circle with doctors, nurses, and therapists, all carrying their own burdens of guilt and stress. As others shared their stories, Rachel felt a mix of relief and shame. She wasn't alone in her struggles, but that didn't excuse her actions. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated before finally opening up about Margaret and the investigation. To her surprise, instead of judgment, she was met with understanding nods and supportive glances. One voice, in particular, stood out. James, a nurse with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, spoke about his own journey from burnout to rediscovering his passion for caregiving. After the meeting, James approached Rachel. It takes courage to admit our mistakes, he said, but it's the first step towards real change. Rachel felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since that fateful night. As she and James talked, she began to see a path forward, one that would require her to completely reevaluate her approach to patient care and her own self-worth. Rachel stood outside Sarah's modest suburban home, heart pounding. She had tracked down Margaret's daughter, determined to face the consequences of her actions. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. Sarah answered, her face a mix of confusion and anger as she recognized Rachel. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp with pain. I came to apologize," Rachel said, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am for what happened to your mother." Sarah's eyes flashed with fury. "Sorry? You think sorry makes up for my mother dying alone? For her feeling abandoned in her final hours?" Rachel flinched at the raw emotion in Sarah's voice. She had prepared herself for anger, but the reality of facing Margaret's grieving daughter was far more intense than she had imagined. "No, it doesn't," Rachel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing I can say will make this right, but I want to understand. I want to listen to you, to hear about your mother, to know what she went through." Sarah stared at Rachel for a long moment, torn between slamming the door and unleashing her pin-up grief. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing Rachel to enter. The conversation that followed was tense and painful. Sarah spoke of her mother's fear of dying alone, of the little things that had brought Margaret joy in her final days, things Rachel had been too busy to notice. As Sarah's anger gave way to tears, Rachel found herself at a loss. Her medical training hadn't prepared her for this raw human moment. Hesitantly, she reached out, offering a tissue to Sarah. "I can't change what happened," Rachel said softly, "but I want to help somehow. Maybe we could organize something for the community, a support group for families of terminal patients." Sarah looked at Rachel skeptically, but there was a flicker of interest in her eyes. "You do that?" Rachel nodded, realizing that this was the beginning of a long, difficult journey towards making amends and rediscovering her purpose as a nurse. Rachel and James sat at a small cafe, papers and notebooks spread across the table between them. They were deep in planning mode for an upcoming community event focused on palliative care and emotional support for terminal patients and their families. "We need to address the gap between medical care and emotional support," Rachel said, her voice filled with newfound passion. "I was so caught up in procedures that I forgot about the person behind the patient." James nodded, jotting down notes. "What if we invite both healthcare professionals and families to speak? It could bridge the communication gap." As they discussed logistics, Rachel noticed Sarah enter the cafe. Their eyes met, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah approached their table. "I saw the flyers for your event," Sarah said, tone guarded but curious. "Are you really going through with this?" Rachel straightened, meeting Sarah's gaze. "Absolutely. In fact, we'd love your input. Your experience could help a lot of people." Sarah hesitated, then pulled up a chair. As she listened to their plans, her skepticism began to fade, replaced by a grudging respect for Rachel's determination. As the planning continued, Sarah found herself opening up about her own struggles. "Sometimes I feel guilty for trying to move on," she admitted quietly. "Like I'm betraying Mom's memory by not being sad all the time." Rachel reached out, gently touching Sarah's hand. "Grief isn't linear. There's no right or wrong way to feel." James added, "Part of what we want to address in the event is the long-term impact on families. Your perspective would be invaluable." Sarah looked between them, her expression softening. Maybe I could help with a family support section," she offered tentatively. Rachel smiled, feeling a mix of hope and determination. This event wasn't just about redeeming herself. It was about creating real change and helping people like Sarah find healing. The community center buzzed with activity as people filed in for the palliative care awareness event. Rachel stood near the entrance, greeting attendees with a warmth that was once foreign to her. Her eyes scanned the crowd, a mix of healthcare professionals, patients, and family members. As the presentations began, Rachel found herself deeply moved by the stories shared. A husband spoke about the final days with his wife, emphasizing how small acts of kindness from nurses made a world of difference. A doctor admitted to struggling with burnout and rediscovering his passion through mindfulness practices. When it was Rachel's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "A few months ago, I thought I had it all figured out," she began, her voice steady. I was efficient, professional, and completely missing the point of what it means to be a caregiver. She went on to share her experience with Margaret, not shying away from her failures. As she spoke about her journey towards understanding the importance of emotional support, she noticed tears in the eyes of many listeners. Her words seemed to resonate, especially with the healthcare professionals in the room. After the formal presentations, Rachel mingled with the attendees. Many approached her, sharing their own experiences and thanking her for her honesty. She felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before, even at the height of her career success. Sarah, who had been watching from the sidelines, made her way to Rachel. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with this," she admitted. "But seeing all these people here, talking openly about these issues, it's making a difference." Rachel smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "It's just the beginning," she said. "There's so much more we can do." As the event wound down, Rachel received news that her nursing license had been reinstated. While it was a relief, she realized that her journey of redemption and growth was far from over. The real work was just beginning. In the weeks following the event, Rachel found herself spending more time with Margaret's family. She sat in their living room, surrounded by photo albums and mementos of Margaret's life. As Sarah and her siblings shared stories, Rachel listened intently, getting to know the woman she had failed on a personal level. "Mom always loved gardening," Sarah said, pointing to a photo of Margaret tending to a vibrant flower bed. Even in the hospital, she'd talk about her plants. Rachel felt a pang of regret, remembering how she dismissed Margaret's attempts to discuss her garden. "I wish I'd taken the time to listen," she admitted. "There's so much I could have learned from her." As Rachel opened up about her own experiences and the pressures that led to her negligence, the family's initial hostility began to soften. They saw her not as the cold, efficient nurse who had failed their mother, but as a flawed human being struggling to make amends. Inspired by these conversations, Rachel and Sarah decided to organize a memorial ceremony for Margaret. They worked together, planning every detail to honor Margaret's life and legacy. On the day of the ceremony, the hospital chapel was filled with Margaret's friends, family, and even some of the hospital staff. Rachel stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she began to speak. "Margaret Johnson was more than a patient," she said, her voice strong despite her nerves. "She was a mother, a gardener, a friend. In failing to see her as a whole person, I failed in my duty as a nurse and as a human being." As Rachel continued, acknowledging her mistakes and celebrating Margaret's life, she saw tears in the eyes of many in the audience. Sarah, sitting in the front row, nodded encouragingly. "Margaret's legacy," Rachel concluded, "will live on in the lessons she taught us about compassion, dignity, and the importance of truly seeing each person we care for." As applause filled the chapel, Rachel felt a sense of catharsis. This wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a significant milestone in her path to redemption and growth. As the chapel emptied after the ceremony, Rachel found herself surrounded by colleagues from the hospital. Many approached her with newfound respect, impressed by her honesty and dedication to change. Dr. Patel, her former supervisor, pulled her aside. "Rachel, I've been watching your progress," he said, his tone serious but not unkind. "What you've done here, it's remarkable. We've been discussing implementing a new palliative care program, and I think you'd be the perfect person to lead it." Rachel was stunned. "Are you serious? After everything that happened?" Dr. Patel nodded. "Your experience gives you a unique perspective. You understand the importance of emotional care in a way many of us have forgotten. This could be a chance to change the system from within." As Rachel considered the offer, she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was an opportunity to make a real difference, to ensure that no patient would feel as neglected as Margaret had. Meanwhile, Sarah approached, her eyes bright with an idea. "Rachel, I've been thinking. What if we didn't stop here? What if we started a nonprofit organization in Mom's name?" Rachel turned to her, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "An organization focused on promoting emotional care in hospitals," Sarah explained. "We could offer training programs, support groups, maybe even fund research into better palliative care practices." The two women looked at each other, a spark of shared purpose igniting between them. What had started as a tragedy was transforming into something potentially revolutionary. "We could call it Margaret's Garden," Rachel suggested, remembering the photos of Margaret's beloved flowers. "A place where compassion and care can grow." Sarah smiled, tears welling in her eyes. She would have loved that. As they began to discuss the possibilities, Rachel felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything she'd experienced in her career. She was no longer just a nurse climbing the corporate ladder. She was becoming an advocate for change in a system that desperately needed it. Just as Rachel was beginning to feel like her life was back on track, a bombshell dropped. She received a call from the hospital's legal department informing her that the investigation into Margaret's death had been reopened due to new evidence. Rachel's heart sank as she learned that someone had come forward with additional information about the night Margaret died. The details were vague, but it was clear that her hard-won redemption was now in jeopardy. As she delved deeper into the situation, Rachel uncovered a disturbing truth. One of the hospital directors, Dr. Elliot Chambers, had been in collusion with the initial anonymous complaint. It wasn't just about Rachel's negligence. There was a larger scheme at play. Dr. Chambers, it turned out, had been pushing for budget cuts in the palliative care unit for years. He saw Rachel's mistake as an opportunity to discredit the entire department, push through his cost-cutting measures. Rachel confronted Dr. Chambers in his office, her voice steady despite her anger. "You used Margaret's death as a pawn in your political game," she accused. Chambers sneered, his facade of professionalism crumbling. "You made it easy, Adams. Your ambition, your neglect, you played right into my hands. And now, with this new evidence, I'll finish what I started." As Rachel left his office, her mind raced. She knew she had to act fast to protect not only herself but also the changes she and Sarah were trying to implement. She reached out to Sarah, explaining the situation. "We need to expose Chambers," Rachel said, "but it's going to be risky. Are you with me?" Sarah hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "Mom would want us to fight this. What's the plan?" Together, they began to gather evidence, reaching out to other staff members who had witnessed Chambers' questionable behavior over the years. They were in for a fight, but Rachel was determined not to let her past mistakes define her future or the future of patient care at the hospital. Rachel and Sarah worked tirelessly to build their case against Dr. Chambers. They collected testimonies from nurses who had been pressured to cut corners, obtained financial records showing suspicious budget allocations, and even uncovered evidence of Chambers manipulating patient satisfaction surveys. As the day of the hospital board meeting approached, Rachel felt a mix of determination and anxiety. This was more than just clearing her name. It was about exposing a systemic problem that put patients at risk. The boardroom was tense as Rachel and Sarah presented their findings. Dr. Chambers sat at the end of the table, his face a mask of cool indifference. As Rachel spoke, laying out the evidence of Chambers' misconduct, she could see the shock and disbelief on the faces of the other board members. "Dr. Chambers didn't just use my mistake to push his agenda," Rachel concluded. "He actively created an environment where such mistakes were more likely to happen. His policies prioritized cost-cutting over patient care, putting lives at risk." Sarah then stepped forward, presenting statements from families who had lost loved ones under circumstances similar to Margaret's. The emotional impact was palpable. Dr. Chambers attempted to discredit their claims, but his arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. As the meeting progressed, his composure cracked, and he lashed out, inadvertently revealing even more about his unethical practices. The board's decision was unanimous. Dr. Chambers was immediately removed from his position and would face a full investigation, potentially leading to legal consequences. In the aftermath, Rachel found herself hailed as a whistleblower and patient advocate. Awards and recognition followed, but she found that these accolades meant little compared to the real change she was seeing in hospital policies and patient care. The true reward came in quiet moments, seeing a nurse take extra time with a terminal patient, or receiving a thank you note from a family grateful for the compassionate care their loved one received. As Rachel and Sarah stood together at the opening of the first Margaret's Garden Care Center, they shared a look of understanding. They had transformed a personal tragedy into a force for positive change, honoring Margaret's memory in the most meaningful way possible. Rachel realized that her journey of redemption wasn't about regaining her former status, but about redefining what success truly meant in the field of healthcare. It was about compassion, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what was right, even in the face of adversity.